Where we've been in this particular course during the last few months, in December we talked about the inner nature of faith. January we talked about people of the Trinity. And then in our last class, we talked about gifted by the Spirit. So we've sort of been setting the stage with talks about Jesus and the Spirit and talks about faith and so forth. Getting now into the area of ongoing spiritual practice, the dynamics of Christian spirituality, conversion is really at the heart of it. And so in this first slide here, we see what do we mean by conversion? What is entailed? And I'll be using in this class the writings of Bernard Lonergan, whom I've referred to in other classes. Lonergan, Daniel Hill-Miniak, Sister Carla Mae Streeter, others in that way of talking about spirituality and spiritual growth. Conversion is metanoia. You're all, I'm sure, familiar with that word and have run into it. The Greek word metanoia means a change of mind, a change of heart, a change of consciousness. In the paper that you were given to read, one of them talked about metanoia as completely reversing course. You're going in one direction, and now you're making an about face. You're going in a completely different direction. And for most of us, that's not what ongoing conversion is going to be about. We are no longer living our lives in the grip of sin or selfishness or addictions. We're on the spiritual journey, and it's not bragging to say that. It's acknowledging what God has done. We're living in the life of the Spirit, under the influence of the Spirit. Our lives are not ruled by sin, and so for us, conversion is not about reversing course. Reversing course would be backsliding. It would be going back into that other kind of life. But there is an ongoing surrender and growth that is called for, and that's what this class will be about, primarily. An ongoing, deepening surrender to God in all the levels of our being. That recognizes the possibility that we can go back, although for most of us it's unlikely that we'll backslide all the way into being an unbeliever whose life is just caught up in the world and ruled by selfishness and sin. At least I hope that's true for all of us. Very early in the Christian life, that possibility is quite strong. But after a while, you know you're not going back there, but you know that if you quit working at it, you do lose ground. Ongoing conversion is about the prevention of that happening so that we continue to grow. Ongoing conversion entails an openness to grace and the channels of grace. In one of the papers that I had given you to read, they talked about people who are not on the spiritual journey, people who need conversion. They're not even interested in grace. And perhaps you've talked to people like that in your life. They're not even interested in God. And you talk to them about that. I mean, I was talking to a guy about the Shroud of Turin the other day. And, you know, I could have been talking about some artifact in a museum, some, regular artifact from something in early America, from the 18th century. The Shroud of Turin was to him, just like that. And he had little interest at all in what might have been implied by that relic. Ongoing conversion entails a redirection, constantly redirecting the will from self-centeredness toward God, reformation of the mind, changing certain behaviors that are incongruent with the ways of God. And we can talk about God and love interchangeably, that what we're opening ourselves here to is love. More and more opening ourselves to love. We're going to be talking in this presentation about different types of conversion. One type we'll call religious conversion. And for Lonergan, that means being in love, having our lives controlled by love. Religious conversion as a conscious surrender of our life and will to the care of God and the guidance of the Spirit. That goes on at the core of our being, and that's represented by the red circle in the middle. Religious conversion goes to the core. And I'm using the term religious instead of spiritual because, remember, we talked about religion as relinking with God, reconnecting with God, religar. And spiritual can refer more to a kind of quality of awareness, sensitivity to meaning, those kinds of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be about God. We're going to be talking about intellectual conversion, about pursuing what is true, avoiding what is false. And that's the blue circle. It's the one adjacent to religious. It supports it in many ways. It's not as interior as religious conversion, but it is still pretty deep in our consciousness. We'll talk about moral conversion, about doing the good and avoiding evil, about living by values. It implies moral formation and fidelity to the imperatives of one's consciousness and conscience, the green circle. And finally, psychological conversion, which is working with the psyche and emotions, imagination, dreams. This is the journey toward wholeness, the integration of opposites, the ego-self relationship. It's a very important one because the psychological part of our being is the level through which our moral, intellectual, and religious life is expressed. And so when there's a brokenness at that level, it distorts how we express what's going on in those more interior levels. And there could be another level outside of that, the life of the body. But the life of the body is going to be determined pretty much by our moral values and our psychological well-being, how we care for the body. The body's not something that has to be converted. The spirit and the psyche need to be converted, and then the body will be taken care of once we get straight about that. Now, if you look at these four circles, you can, ask some questions here. Is it possible, for example, for a person to work on psychological integration, but not have gone very far in religious conversion? And if any of you want to type a comment about that, or just a yes or a no, what do you think? Is it possible to be psychologically integrated and moving in a direction of wholeness, but not having done much work in the religious? One of the things we're going to address today. Or, here's another one. Is it possible for a person to be doing good work with religious and intellectual conversion, but still needing to do work in the psychological realm? It surely is. So these levels are not the same, and generally we don't work on them all at once. We'll begin with the inner core, religious conversion, which we've already said a great deal about through a number of presentations, and so this will just be really recapping some of that. Religious conversion is about the move from being self-centered to God-centered. From centered on what I want, to what does love call for. So it's about moving out of ourselves toward others and God in love. The core concerns of religious conversion: faith is one, and we had a whole class on that. Surrender to God. Centeredness, and centeredness asks the question is like, what's the most important thing in your life? And what Jesus calls our treasure. Its concern is empowerment. Where do we find the energy and the motivation? And overcoming selfishness. It recognizes the reality of mixed motives. And few of us have completely pure motives. And some of Jesus' parables recognized that weeds and wheat grow together. The harvest is made and the dragnet is thrown into the sea. There'll be a sorting process that we go through as well. For many of us, there's kind of a civil war that goes on, an awareness of a struggle between a movement towards selfishness, self-concern, and a movement that calls us to love. And I think that civil war is a good thing. And when I have directees that talk about that civil war, that's one of the things I tell them. I said, this is good. If the Civil War wasn't going on, you'd probably just be consumed by selfishness. Because sinners, people whose lives are controlled by the power of sin, have no great civil war. Their heart and their conscience has been blunted. Civil war is not a bad thing. It raises before us the awareness of our selfishness. There's a proverb, Proverbs 24:16 says, "For a righteous man falls 7 times a day." How do you like that? But then it says, "and rises up again." But the wicked are overthrown by calamity. So even the righteous person, and a righteous person in the Old Testament is a person who is right with God. And even these righteous people still sometimes fall. But when they do, that other energy and law at work in their being raises them up again. The issues in the spiritual life do change, and it does get easier. I mean, the struggles change. After a while, we're not struggling with whether we're going to be in gross sin or not. The issues become more subtle, you might say. Recalling Sister Renee's earlier presentations on the 12 steps, we could see that steps 2 and 3 go to the heart of religious conversion. Step 2 is, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And step 3, made a decision to turn our lives and our will over to the care of God as we understood Him. So coming to believe is sort of a conviction of the mind. There's a lot of reasons to believe, reasons not to believe, but we come to believe, acting on a hope as well, that we will become better, that we will grow in love. And often it's the example of other people in our lives that give us that hope. And in the third step, turning our lives and will over to the care of God, simply asking God into our lives. In light of Father Carey's presentation on process theology, some of the writers on process, particularly one writer, Dennis Edwards, Partaking of God is the name of the book. And again, the name is Partaking of God. Talks about how God waits on us. God waits for our decisions. God is so humble that God has sort of constrained God's action by our free choice. God knows what we need. God knows what we should do. But God waits for us to decide and to ask. And so Jesus says, ask and you will receive, search and you will find. You have to do that, and then God can enter into the process. God's love is a gift, a grace, but we can close ourselves to this. And that's a real possibility. So religious conversion is the active, intentional opening of ourselves to God's gifts, usually accompanied by a recognition of our shortcomings. And so that's where spiritual disciplines of prayer and worship, surrender, discernment, others that we've mentioned in the inner exploration class are so important. They help to sustain in us this active, intentional opening to God. And I find that when people move away from disciplines after a while, it becomes easier for them to not have prayer the next day. It's like when you cut corners on it one day, then the next day it's easier to do it again. When directees go slack in these core disciplines, their openness to and awareness of God's love becomes clouded by selfish desires and fragmented thoughts. It's as though the mind and the spirit become filled with static instead of tuned in. Of all of these disciplines, prayer is, I believe, the most important, and one must learn how to pray. That is an ongoing journey. We've introduced a number of prayer forms, but ultimately it's the Holy Spirit that teaches us to pray and makes use of these different disciplines and prayer methods we've learned. I know many times in my life I've had like a wonderful prayer service one day and then thought, well, now let's see, what did I do? Okay, I started with this, then I did that, and then I went from there, and then I did this, and said, so that's the formula, right? Okay, well, write that down and try it the next day, and lo and behold, it's absolutely nothing like the day before. The spontaneity in the spirit was lost, and so every day is kind of a unique way of opening to God in prayer. I think it's a really good thing when prayer for a person becomes as much a part of their life as taking a shower or eating breakfast or brushing your teeth, things that we would never think of doing without. It's when prayer is something of a negotiable then we're still in trouble. When prayer becomes an indispensable and necessary part of our lives, I think that's a very good sign. So we ask ourselves at this point, how are we experiencing God's call to conversion? What are we being asked to let go of? How are we being called to let God in more fully into our lives? And so we'll just take a few moments to quietly ponder those questions. Okay, the next level of conversion then is intellectual conversion. Something that maybe you've never heard discussed before, although it's there in Scripture all over the place. The intellect is in many ways what people mean by the mind. It has profound influence on the will, and the will is really what religious conversion is about. But the will cannot go where the mind will not agree and where intellectual conviction will not sustain. In his marvelous teaching on love in 1 Corinthians 13, St. Paul writes, "When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me." I think for a lot of people, they had their religious formation as children, maybe adolescents, teenagers, and figured, well, that's it. I'm set. I've learned what I'm supposed to know. But they are sorely in need of an update, of needing to put the childish ways of thinking and understanding aside and understand things better as adults, because adult experience is much more complex than the kinds of answers they were given as children. An old saying has it that Jesus taught adults and played with children, but the church does the opposite. And I think there's some truth to that. Children should be taught for sure, but many adults need to have a serious update in their understanding of God, how God works, how God is present in their lives, and so forth. I discovered this firsthand during my years in college. I was, as many of you know, first career was as a biologist. And many of my professors were either agnostics or atheists, and some of them were downright hostile toward religion and especially Christianity. In their teachings on evolution or whatever, they throw out little snide remarks, little innuendos, and it would confuse me very much. I grew up in a small town in South Louisiana where everybody was Christian, and nobody dared to ridicule religious beliefs in any way. And here were these men doing it in front of sometimes classrooms full of hundreds of students. And the confusion was in part that I had no response to them. I didn't know what to say. How do you respond to what they're saying? I mean, I know what they said was criticism, and I know that it bothers me, but I don't know how to respond to that. That was just simply pointing up for me that I had a need to update my understanding. That became an urgent part of my own growth process in graduate school, and I was in graduate school in biology for a number of years, and also began to really study and reflect more deeply on my Christian faith as well. The core concern of intellectual conversion is the truth, valuing the truth. In John 8:32, Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." There's an old saying that if you have to choose between Jesus and the truth, choose the truth, or it will always lead you to Christ. What do you think of that? If you have to choose between Jesus and the truth, choose the truth. Now, I think what that's supposedly saying is that if there's a conflict between the truth and our understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus' life was about, we probably need to work on our understanding of Jesus, because it's the understanding of Jesus that is biased or distorted in some way. And that is a core concern of intellectual conversion, is overcoming this intellectual bias. Intellectual bias is very strong. Biases concerning who God is, who we are, what God expects, and so forth. And because the intellectual level is so deep, it's sort of inherently conservative. It's a big thing to change those kinds of paradigms and perspectives. Here's another issue. Sometimes we do not feel God's love, do we? We don't feel it. We don't feel it. And so we proceed in our lives, in our Christian journey, from these convictions about the truth. They are the light that guides us. In John 20:29, Jesus said, "Blessed are they who believe, but who have not seen." And what does it mean to see here? It means to actually have religious experience. And I think religious experience is extremely important. But it's not always there when I would like it to be there. Sometimes faith is remembering in the darkness what we've seen in the light and proceeding by convictions concerning what we know to be true or what we value as truth. There's lots of dimensions to truth, of course. There's a scientific dimension. There's truth about and in relationships, philosophical truth, theological truth. These ought not to be in conflict with each other, but it can take some real work to sort out. The struggle to come to know truth leads to growth in knowledge and wisdom, which are gifts of the Spirit as well. The Spirit can and does infuse gifts of knowledge and wisdom into us, but it builds on our own searching and study. Intellectual conversion helps us to become free from the enslavement of biases and ignorance, to live our lives and direct our lives according to the light of truth. And it's not just for intellectual types, Jungian thinking types, we're going to talk about later today when we talk about psychological types. This is for everyone. The way into this conversion process is through the process of questioning and clarifying. Ask and you will receive. He's not just talking about asking for stuff. He's talking about asking questions that we want answers to also. There's an old Zen story. The disciple says, "Where did the sky come from?" And the master says, "Where does your question come from?" Sometimes our questions are invitations from God to understand God better. Many times people, however, have been, discouraged from questioning, told it was disrespectful, had their questions ridiculed, shut down the whole conversation. Sometimes people were uncomfortable with our questions. I remember when I was 8 years old, I asked my mom, "Mom, if Jesus knew he was going to rise from the dead, then why was he so nervous in the Garden of Gethsemane?" My mom was a wise woman. She said, "Ask Sister Virginia and see what she says. And then come and tell me, and we'll talk about it." And I don't remember how it went after that. What Sister Virginia said, I remember asking my mom, and I remember her saying that. And she was okay with me saying that, but she didn't quite know what to say either. So I'm grateful that it was okay to ask the question at least. I don't remember if Sister Virginia was okay with me asking the question, but I don't have a bad memory associated with it, so I'm assuming it went okay. I know many times my questions got the response, "Oh, it's a mystery, we're not supposed to understand that." And so for me, mystery, when people said it's a mystery, that means end of the discussion, essentially on the same level as "because I said so," or that sort of thing, Only later did I come to see that mystery doesn't mean something we can't understand. It means something we can't fully understand. We can't completely wrap our minds around it. The mystery is like the ocean or a lake, let's say Lake Superior. You can get a drink of water from Lake Superior and feel full, but you can't drink all the water. There's just too much there, and that's what a mystery is like. Questions lead us to reading and dialogue, and ultimately then community. Our answers raise new questions, which are invitations to further growth. Sometimes directees say they don't know what they believe about their faith, or they've read this book and it confuses them. And I tell them, that's good. That's good. They kind of seems taken aback by that. What do you mean that's good? I said, well, what exactly are the questions that are coming out here? Write them down and make a list of them. What are these questions? Sometimes I'll have some suggested books for them to read, and sometimes I'll tell them, well, now go do some searching. So again, life experience has often shown up old understandings to be inadequate. There are ambiguities in life. It's not always black and white. Discernment's not always easy. Truth is not always clear. But if we hold fast to the questions, the Spirit will lead us forward to new understandings. Religious questions in particular are what we're most interested in spirit life, especially for our spiritual directees. Who is God? Who is Christ? What do I really believe? I have been taught thus and so, but what makes sense now? It can take time to sort this out. And the religious core of our being will be well supported for our doing so. We're not the first to raise these questions. I've just noticed many times I raise a question and think, well, gosh, where am I ever going to find out about that? And then discover there's hundreds of web pages about it, books and books, and it's like, oh boy, other people have thought about this. So great. The disciplines then are study, dialogue, reflection, meditation. Paul says in Romans 12, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then, and I love this, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Transformed by the renewing of your mind, then you'll be able to test and approve. So you have to do your work. Dominican spirituality emphasizes study, and so many of the great Dominican saints were giants of wisdom and knowledge. Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, of course, but this spirit of recognizing the need for the importance of study. So what are your questions at this time in life? You don't have to share them. Just take a few minutes, jot them down for yourself. If you want to jot them down to share with others, that's fine. We'll just take a few moments of silence for you to do that. What are your questions at this time in life? Hold on to those questions. They'll take you somewhere. Moral conversion, then. Moral conversion begins to get into the issue of how we express our inner life. What are the actions and choices that we make? As the old saying goes, action flows from state of being, which is what religious and intellectual conversion are concerned with. So I'll throw out a question here, and you can think about it, or just any of you want to write a little answer, that's fine. Can a person be good and moral without being a Christian? Yes. Yeses are coming out all over the place, sure. You all know people like that, right? It used to confuse me to say, they don't even go to church, and they're probably better than I am. Look at that, you know? It's like, it just shows that basic moral values and good actions can be known and valued by all people, religious or not. What religious and intellectual conversion makes for is more of a consistency of moral action and a depth of moral action as well. But the golden rule, do not do to others what you do not want them to do to you. I'd say everybody probably goes by that. If you put it in the negative, treat people the way you want to be treated. Every world religion says something like this. Civil law is based on this sort of principle as well. All human bodies experience pain and pleasure for basically the same reasons. Psychological needs are more complex, but no one likes to be insulted, ignored, or lied to. No society would work without some measure of honesty and goodwill among people. So there's a common sense aspect to morality. Even the founding fathers in the United States says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They weren't operating out of a Christian conviction when they said that. Many of them weren't Christians, they were deists. So Christian life holds to at least these standards and an even higher one. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So we're called to, as Jesus would say many times, even the tax collectors and sinners are good to those who are good to them. He calls us to a higher standard of moral behavior. The core concern being living a life of love, making good and loving choices. Christ here being both the model and the example for us. Moral conversion is also very much about the formation of conscience. Conscience being our inner moral compass, directed by the Spirit. Living with the question, what is the loving thing to do in this situation? There's some beautiful writings about conscience in the Vatican II documents, and I'll share a little quote from that. And it goes like this, the old language, non-inclusive. In the depths of his conscience, man detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience, always summoning him to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For man has in his heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of man. According to it he will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a man. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. In a wonderful manner, conscience reveals that law which is fulfilled by love of God and neighbor. So they're talking about how this moral sensitivity can be informed by that religious core. They go on to note, however, that conscience frequently errs without losing its dignity. But the same cannot be said for a man who cares little for truth and goodness, or for a conscience which by degrees grows practically sightless as a result of habitual sin. That we can lose a sensitivity to conscience. And so moral conversion is about maintaining and developing and forming this right conscience. The life of habitual sin, they say, blunts the guidance of conscience. Many even can feel guilty about acts that are not especially immoral. You see scrupulosity. Sometimes a person, has an overly sensitive conscience, probably a conscience that is also influenced by some psychological wounding. The next point, that conscience is formed in the context of family, school, church, and culture, and so forth. We have heroes and models who are very important to us in the formation of conscience. One of the dysfunctional family rules, do as I say, not as I do, is not helpful for the formation of conscience. So proper formation of conscience takes study, reflection, examination. We can read the lives of people who lived good and moral lives, church teaching on various issues, prayer, dialogue with other Christians can be very important. Knowing the right thing to do, it's not always black and white, is it? There might be many good reasons for doing something one way and many good reasons for doing it another way. And so this really listening to what is the best way, what is God calling me, does require this attending to conscience. We'll stop here and let you reflect briefly. How are you being called to form your conscience at this time? And what moral questions do you struggle with? Okay, next we look at psychological conversion, which is different but also related to the other conversions. Someone in the Bible asked the question, who do people say that I am? Who asked that question? Well, we know who asked that question. Yes, Jesus. It's sort of a rhetorical question. Maybe he really was wanting to know who people said that he was to try to get an idea of what their understanding might be, what their expectations are. But that is for all of us, right at the heart of our psychological identity is who am I? And it's related to the other levels of conversion, but it's here in the psychological level that we experience self-image, self-concept, feeling about ourselves, and so forth. Who do you say that you are? It's a question I'm sure you ask yourself sometimes. Jot down a few ideas. At this time in your life, who do you say that you are? I wonder how your answer would compare with what you would have written 5, 10, or 20 years ago. This, too, is an ongoing journey, psychological conversion and self-discovery. The core concern, however, is authenticity, coming to authentic self-knowledge, not what other people say about me or what they believe about me, but what I claim about myself. It's an ongoing process of sorting things out. It's also about integrating the psyche with our moral, spiritual, and intellectual dimensions of life. Ultimately, it's about moving from an identity rooted in the persona or mask that we show the world to an identity that is rooted in God. And those of you who have the great fortune of reading and studying the book God and I know what I mean by an ego self God relationship or an identity rooted in the persona. An identity rooted in a persona or mask is an identity where we're trying to be what other people expect us to be so that we can get some sort of positive response from them, approval, good regard, that they'll be impressed with us. An identity rooted in God, however, is a very different kind of focus. And the journey from an ego persona identity to an ego centered in God is really right at the heart of the religious journey. It entails inner healing, overcoming shame, that sense of harsh judgment we have, being no good and unworthy. And the good news for all of us here is that there's been so much available to deal with psychological healing and growth in the 20th century, more than ever before in history. The emergence in the 20th century of psychology as an empirical human science has been a great gift for all of us. One can have a relatively well-formed religious, intellectual, and moral core, but have psychological bias distort this expression. You believe that? Have you seen that? Experienced that? I know that for me that is certainly true. Psychological conversion and development for me came after I had done a considerable amount of work in the religious, intellectual, and moral development. I had good disciplines going. I had come to some clarity concerning my questions, but there was a piece that had not been addressed, and that was the psychological dimension. And it wasn't until I became unemployed as a campus minister and sought a job and became an alcohol and drug abuse counselor that I really had to deal with that, because it was looking at me in the face all the time and stirring things up. And I discovered that I really had some work to do in that area, some healing that needed to be done. And the 12 steps were a very important tool to use to sort through that. And I think one of the gifts of the steps, and I know we've talked about them in previous classes, is that the steps aren't just focused on psychological conversion. They're integrating psychological, moral, and religious conversion. They're kind of neglecting intellectual conversion. They leave you to figure that out for yourself. This God, as I understand him, part, okay, that you go do that work somewhere else. You're not going to do it in your support group. but the other levels of conversion are being addressed. It's largely about dealing with family of origin issues, abuse and neglect being the most extreme examples. Family of origin here just doesn't refer strictly to our nuclear family, extended family. You might think of it as the whole developmental environment in which we grew up. What was that environment like? What did we learn from it? What scars have we taken from it? How do these scars continue to influence us today? What traumas have we undergone that have not yet been healed? What repressed feelings might we be needing to attend to? Low self-esteem from shame, anger issues from repressed anger, post-traumatic shock. Those are common examples of family of origin issues that need to be addressed. The third point there, we also need to learn to work with issues pertaining to boundaries, communication, and identity. That was a work that I especially had to learn to do. And what I came to understand was that some of the patterns I'd taken from my family of origin, which by the way was, I'd say on the continuum on the relatively healthy side of families, some of the patterns I'd taken into my marriage were not healthy. Patterns of communication were creating problems. Ways of setting boundaries were creating problems. And so I had to learn new skills, and that's part of psychological conversion too. It's not that we don't know how to communicate, for example. Everybody knows how to communicate, even to some extent about their feelings, but is their manner of communication healthy? Is it loving? Does it bring you closer together, or does it drive you apart? Counselors see all the time that human beings have problems. We all do. Can't live life without problems. But then how we talk about the problems with each other creates new problems. The problem is not just that I came home late, for example. The problem is what might be said about that and the names that are called me, and then how I respond back. So I really had to work at this. The good news is that there are skills that we can learn and put into practice that do make a difference. Ultimately, I wrote a book about it, Lessons in Loving. Mostly I wrote all of my books for myself. There are ways that I was sorting things out, and then I put them in packaged them in a way that others might benefit from it as well. Personality types is also an important piece here. Understanding one's type, which is why we will have a class on that this afternoon. What's normal for you might not be normal for others. So here's some disciplines: journaling, dream work, psychological types, counseling, support group, self-help books. We've exposed you to a number of these already in the Spirit Life program, and they really do have their place in the spiritual life. So a few more comments on interactions among these. It's difficult to do deep work on all four processes at once. I mean, you can give some attention to all of them every day, but it generally seems that there are times in life when one of them comes into the front burner and needs more work than others. The primacy of religious conversion needs to be affirmed as well. This is the core that shapes the fundamental orientation of one's life and energizes the other levels and gives us hope and encouragement to work on these other levels, where we find our deepest love and our truest identity and inner power. That's from that religious core. The interdependence of all four processes, they are not the same, but they are related and they influence in each other. And generally, progress in one conversion level influences the others in a very positive way. I've seen many times, for example, where people will get involved in a 12-step group and it leads them back to their faith. They had neglected the faith of their childhood, and now they became more interested in God, and, well, what's the first place they turn? It's kind of where they left off. Sometimes psychological work opens a person to becoming more interested in the religious dimension. So people don't always start off in the same place because all the paths are different kinds of needs. But if they really are growing in one area, then eventually they usually do become interested in the other levels as well. Finally, it's difficult to grow spiritually without attending to all four conversion processes. The loving energy in the core of our being seeks expression in the outer world, and so this calls us to do work in the other three levels. You might ask yourself the question at this time, of these four different kinds of conversion, which are you being called to give more attention to at this time in your life? Would be one question for you to ponder at the end here.